The recent participation by Simone in the Graham Centre trial for the use of dairy waste with irrigated crop, a trial which is testing the agronomic impact of compost being applied using commercial spreader at commercial rates onto paddocks being grazed by dairy cattle. And, you know, we know there's a lot of dairy farmers in Australia. I mean, they also have the beef aspect as well, because they've got to... I'm not great up on beef, so I might put my foot in it here. I love cattle, but we don't run a beef industry. But I know, talking to Simone, just how they have to drill down. And you also have a stud too, don't you? They have a Holstein? Oh, I got that right. They also have a Holstein stud. So they're also into the breeding and the genetics as well as production. But Simone's going to show you today the benefits of turning their dairy waste into a fertiliser for them to reapply back onto their pastures and the cows. So I would really like to welcome Simone. Simone is doing wonderful things in the dairy industry. I don't know whether she'll have a chance to talk about that, but she's becoming one of the main leaders in the dairy industry. And as I say, I'm not against men, but I think it's great to see women taking the role of promoting agriculture and being in the industries as well. So I'll get Simone's presentation up. Just a moment.
I guess what I've looked at today is my story so far. So this is very new to me. I met Rhonda in 2008, and it's certainly been a changing experience. And I guess I'd preface my story by what has worked for us and what we do in all of our aspects of our business. It is a learning process and we apply it, but it isn't a blanket answer to everyone. And particularly with dairy, I always acknowledge that dairy is very different from one operation to another. And I think that's actually why I love dairy so much. I started off at university. I did a Bachelor of Rural Science up in Armidale, and I was very focused on animal production. And I did soils at university, and I really just poked my way through soils, and I really didn't grasp how important they were. And in 2008, I realised that they were more important than I'd ever given them credit for, and that as much as I had the capability and could access anything that I needed to get our cows to produce, I could see that our herd was no longer as healthy, and that there were actually costs to pushing our animals to the extent that we were doing that. So I guess just in brief, my husband and I moved out to the family farm in 2000, where we began share farming. We moved into complete management before we took over ownership in 2008, so 2008 was a massive year for us. I came up to my first Wildlife conference in the February, and we had a turner at home in the May that year. The drought has obviously been in that 10 years, and I think it's been the steepest learning curve for ourselves as well as most other farmers. Neil is by far the genetics behind our business, and that's a massive part of our business, so Currajug or Holsteins. And I have always looked after the nutrition, and that now obviously the soil and the feed that we grow on farm is so important to that now. I guess the things that I'd like to cover today is basically how did we come to be making humus compost, what our initial goals were back in 2008, what has changed, and basically assessing our achievements, and then finally I'll touch on those field trials that have been operated on our property with the Graham Centre. Those trials were funded by Dairy New South Wales and CMA essentially, and also the Graham Centre provided their time. So how did we come to be making humus compost? Firstly, Neil and I have always had a very adaptive attitude, and I think adoptive as well. Running a business is what we do. I think the days of lifestyle farming, and I think most people would agree, are gone. And we plan on being here and being sustainable into the future, and so we need to do what's necessary. We've done multiple things, so as well as purchasing the farm in 2008, we also moved at that time to 3 times a day milking, which we did quite successfully for 18 months. There's multiple reasons that we don't continue with that now, but primarily milk price and labour shortages are the main reasons. So that's just an example. We were the only people in our region at the time doing it. It provides us with about a 20% increase in our production, but it has to be sustainable, and it just wasn't anymore. So we've ceased that at this point in time. I guess the second issue for why we came to be making humus compost and what attracted me to come up here was we had some herd health issues. So we had salmonella within our herd, and after much digging and investigation, we discovered that the neighbours who had applied raw chicken manure on their paddocks, that had washed off into our calving paddocks. And so we were losing calves. That cost us in excess of $250,000 in lost animals, lost production, and sick animals. We also had mastitis, and we had mastitis that was contagious. We had Streptococcus agalactae, as well as Staph aureus, and those mastitis were contagious within the dairy between cows, and just the treatment, the stress, the loss of income, we're not really sure where they came from, but it was highly stressful at the time to deal with, and there just had to be a better way, and it was also just another indication of the health status of our animals. And finally, as a result of the drought, we had enormous amounts of byproducts. So not only were there eyesores on the farm, it was something that I really began to think that we could start to recycle this and utilise it. We are actually, we participated in a project that was run out through Australia called Accounting for Nutrients, and there were 44 dairy farms that were in that program, and they were basically looking at total imports of nutrients and total exports of nutrients, and that really identified for us that we were mass importers of nutrients, and nutrients were being wasted and not recycled on our property. We don't have a feed pad, we feed in hay racks, and so as you can see, that's generating manure, waste feed. Hay racks, you can potentially be having up to 25% wastage of your feed that's going in there. So I guess the journey began in May 2008. Here we are setting out our first rows. Our feed stocks essentially are things that we get on farm. So our calves are bedded on wood shavings in the calf shed. There's manure from around those hay racks and waste feed. There's also manure from loafing areas. We had sacrifice paddocks during the drought. And so when we cleaned those up, then there's waste feed, there's paddocks. We have been known to go through and cut paddocks of just dry standing feed in summer if we haven't needed it, or weeds, and bale it up and put that into the compost. We've had wet hay from neighbours that's been flooded. And then Neil's brother and now his parents actually both own supermarkets, so we've had cardboard from them as well. I guess what really attracted me, and what I'd always been aware of, I'd always had concerns about utilising raw manure as a fertiliser source. And so what attracted me to this process and to making our own humified compost was around that the particle management really equalled quality. And so, as was discussed for those of you that were here yesterday, it was all about getting everything touching everything, and that will give us the best outcome. The alternative, as you can see down on the right, is basically just piled up crap. You've got no confidence at at all as to what the consistency of the breakdown in that process is as regards to weeds and pathogens. And given in mind that we were dealing also with a salmonella outbreak, I was really conscious of being certain that I'd killed any pathogens that were going through that compost. I didn't need to be spreading it over my farm any more than it already was. So this was the winter of 2008, and that was us in full production. So what did we want to achieve? We set out in 2008 with 5 key goals, and essentially they were around recycling that on-farm waste that I have shown you, reducing our off-farm inputs, because as I mentioned, we were part of the Accounting for Nutrients trial, and we were net importers. We also were looking to reduce our irrigation. One of the key things that stuck with me was that I think it was Edwin originally said that you could reduce 1/3 of your irrigation. So not only is irrigation fondly known as irritation, it's highly expensive, and it's great for keeping green feed in front of the cows across the summer, but you know, it does come at a cost, and if we could capture and maximise what rain falls and reduce our reliance on irrigation, we felt that that was really setting ourselves up for the future and to manage the uncertainty of water into the future. Obviously, we were really just looking to maintain our pasture production. We didn't set out with any grand schemes or grand goals of where we wanted to go with that. We were satisfied that if we maintained the production, that you know, we'd be on a good footing. And then finally, we were looking to manage those pathogens and weed seeds. So I guess what has changed? Herd health expenses on a per cow basis. What I didn't say was we have also had changes in our cow numbers. So we have milked up to 340 cows. At this point in time, we're only milking 200. We've just had a herd reduction and sold 80 head because in the last 5 years, we've actually been able to increase our replacement stock, and we have more than enough heifers on farm now to replace our whole herd. So we're in a position that we can start to maximise that genetic gain and that herd health, and we're also in a position where we are back to just a husband and wife team with some casual labour, and so 200 is just a much more comfortable number to be milking. So I've looked at everything on a per cow basis. So as you can see, we've saved 32% on our herd health costs. So that was both intramuscular antibiotics as well as our intramammary that we were using within the dairy. Because obviously it wasn't just mastitis and salmonella, there were just all the other ailments that were coming with cows. You know, pneumonia, scouring calves, just generally ill thrift throughout the herd. Now that cost there it is only for the drugs. It doesn't account for our labour saving, and it doesn't account for the loss of income for discarded milk. Because obviously any animal that's treated with antibiotics can be out of the herd for up to 10 days from the last treatment, depending on your choice of therapy. And then I guess the clinker down the bottom is that our milk quality, which is assessed by the somatic cell count, has reduced almost 100,000 units. At 224 average that year, there were months that we were over 250,000, and we get financial penalties for supplying milk that isn't of a standard less than 250,000. So we were also incurring financial penalties on top of the cost of the drugs, the stress on the staff and on ourselves, and the time that was required. Record keeping has always been highly important to us in our business. This is just a snapshot of our software program and just a particular cow that I picked out. Dairying, I grew up with beef. I actually grew up on a beef property just outside of Wagga. But one of the things I love about dairy is the data it generates, and the time that was required. So as you can see, we've saved 32% on our herd health costs. So that was both intramuscular antibiotics as well as our intramammary that we were using within the dairy. The data it generates, and you actually get an answer from when you make a change almost immediately. So if I change paddocks with the milkers from a paddock that may have been treated with something differently to the day before, usually within a day or 2 days, we actually see it on the dipstick in the vat, whether what we've done has been effective. I can change the grain rations in the dairy. Anything I do, we see so quickly, and that's just such a blessing and such a benefit over potentially the beef operations. This information also gives us, it generates an enormous amount of information, but it gives us things like our calving interval has reduced from, we calve all year round, so we were calving at a 15-month calving interval. We've reduced that back to 13.5-month calving interval. For a year-round calving herd, I'm really comfortable and really happy to be sitting there. It may not be the best and it may not be as good as we can achieve, but for me, that's where I'm really happy to be sitting. Our joinings are down to 2.2 joinings from being at nearly 3 joinings. So again, that's a cost saving to our business, and that's what's really important to us. And it obviously is also reflected in that reduced calving interval. Our production on a per cow basis hasn't actually changed enormously. As I said, you got the 20% increase when we were milking 3 times a day. So we had our herd up around 11 and 11,500 litres on a 305-day lactation. Now we're sitting probably about 9.8, a bit under 10,000, so there's your 20% thereabouts. It hasn't changed significantly from pre-2008 to now, but it's the health benefits. I was putting in so many additives. I was feeding up to 12.5 kilos of grain to our cows. The off-farm feed that we were purchasing, and that Bill referenced, that the more feed you are buying in off-farm, it's affecting your bottom line. We're now down feeding as low as 7 kilos per head per day, and I've just cut out so many of the additives, including the antibiotics, out of our daily feed ration. So I guess when we've assessed what we've done, we've also assessed the things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at my cows are the 3 A's. So you're talking appetite, appearance and attitude. So their appetite. Are my cows eating? Do they have an appetite? Are they coming in? Are they happy? And consistently grazing. So even grazing, one of the things we've really noticed over the last few years is the change in how our pastures are grazed. Our pastures are grazed really evenly. We strip graze and they're not leaving patches. They will go in and they'll just clean a paddock up. We also are looking at their appearance. So Gary Zimmer enlightened me on, down here on the bottom left, they're happy lines. I've also heard them called healthy lines. And essentially when I went home and I started to look, the cows that exhibit lines like that down the side of their ribs are bright. They're eating, they're producing well, they've got shiny coats, bright in the face and in the eyes, around the muzzle and the nostril, and the cows that don't have that, they have duller coats. There's something wrong with them. They might have had a touch of pneumonia, maybe early post-calving, they haven't had a good transition and they're doing it a bit tougher. So if I have a high percentage of my herd with happy lines or healthy lines, then I'm really confident that where things are is really where I want to be. On the top right, we're rumen scoring every day. So that cow, obviously, she's not full, but what I'm looking for is when they come into the dairy twice a day, I'm looking that they're full, they're content, they've had a belly full, and they're actually functioning. And down the bottom right, most importantly, is that crapology. So we're also always observing the manure. I don't want to see a lot of grain in my manure. There's a problem either with my mixing process and or the speed of movement through their rumen. If I don't have a nice pat and fibre, it's a real indication for me of where I need to be putting the cows for the next grazing, whether I need to be putting some hay out in the hay racks, and all those things that just lead to a cow having a really balanced rumen and looking after her functionality. And finally is their attitude. That's looking out of our pit, and so there's nothing, you know, that makes a dairy farmer feel happier than when his cows are standing there looking at him, chewing their cuds and happily coming into the bales. Neil and I, particularly when it's the two of us milking, and it is quite interesting when you have staff there, our cows come into the bales. We don't get out of the yards. Our cows willingly come in to be milked. Cow on the bottom there, happily chewing her cud. While cows are resting and chewing their cud, they're making milk. And obviously, like I said, the VAT reading and the dipstick, and that's most important to us. So what else has changed? Our expenditure on fertiliser per hectare has reduced. So as you can see, we were spending, you know, over $170 a hectare back in 08-09, and that's been reduced by 57%. Now, I've included compost in that. So it's not, you know, it's not a free product, there's a cost, and we value our compost at $35 a tonne. So essentially that's any trucking that I might have had to use to get product moved from down around our dairy platform up to where my site is. That's our machinery, that's obviously fuel, and that's a labour. So that's where we sit with our cost of production, and that's where we sit now. We were addicted to fertiliser. We were sowing we were double cropping a lot of our farm, all our irrigation country, and we were going out with 120 kgs of MAP twice a year. We now only sow with 35 kgs of MAP, whatever we're sowing. Obviously fertiliser prices, particularly around urea, have softened since the 08-09, but basically we're using half the fertiliser that we used to use, and urea I'm using less than a third. I have used urea once this season through winter. There are a few paddocks that I was a bit concerned about, and we heard it yesterday, you can't just go from this to this. There's a balance in the middle, but I've gone from applying urea up to 6 times on a paddock in a year to none or once. And we've been able to achieve this. So we were talking again yesterday about solid field stems and hollow stems. And so on the left is actually my photo of our lucerne, and I was having trouble, so Rhonda had also sent me a photo. That basically are the things that have enabled us to reduce our bale feeding, so the grain that we feed in the bales. Like I said, we've fed up to 12.5 kilos per head per day. At 3 times a day milking, twice a day we were feeding 10.5 kilos per head per day, and right now we're grazing twice a day. We're feeding 7 kilograms of grain in the bales, and the cows are now milking better than they have ever milked at twice a day milking. Granted it's spring, but we haven't grazed twice a day since pre-2000. So all through the drought, all we were able to do was sometimes only provide a green pick. So we've been grazing twice a day now for several months, and we expect that with our feed base and our management going forward, we don't see why that should cease certainly until December. And if all our lucerne kicks in, then potentially we'll have the ability to continue grazing and be a pasture-based system going forward. Over the last 5 years, we've also moved to a lucerne pasture base, and we've now got 170 hectares of lucerne in with of our 360 hectares, and with the intent to continue with that base. As I mentioned, we've also dropped a lot of additives out of our grain, and including antibiotics. And I believe that that has also led to the improvement in the health of our cows. The photos here, I was going through my computer looking for photos to put these slides together, and I just happened to come across that photo from 2007. It was a photo I'd taken to email to our consultant, Not From Wagga, and just to show him what was going on at the time. And what stood out to me there is, as much as the swards are similar from then to now, it doesn't come across particularly clearly, but there's certainly tipping on the left and the ends of the ryegrass pasture there, and it isn't as thick a sward as the one on the right, but they're the same paddocks. When it comes to looking at the soil results and to looking at where things have gone there, what I can say is that in the 5 years since we've been doing this, we've been able to improve our cation exchange capacities from around 8 to 10 to 10 to 13. Our pHs have increased from we were sitting around 5.4 to 5.6. We sit around 6.3 to 6.6 now. And I actually attribute a lot of that to our lack of urea. Our cation proportion is slowly correcting itself. We had a very high hydrogen, which basically is we had a tight soil. Our soils are still, you know, a long way to go and a long way to improve, but they've certainly improved a long way, and they're visibly not as tight. I'm not allowed to run a lot of trials on farm anymore because Neil doesn't like having the bits of paddock that don't look as good as the rest. But I was known to run, 22 metre strips through whole paddocks with no urea application. And, you're talking 2-3 years down the track, you could still walk across that paddock after it's been prepped for sowing, and the clods under your feet just didn't break until you got to where the compost had been. And the clods, you'd walk on them and they'd just break. And we've done the things, we've taken the shovel out and we've smelt the soil. And this has been our learning experience. And I still just have so much to learn. Our toolbox has ever been increasing. We started out just applying compost. Then the next year we started to add some gypsum and some lime, and now we've started to use some boron humates. And it's just an ever-building toolbox, and it's a slow process probably, but it is at my rate, and we're really happy with the results. And as long as I understand what we're doing, and I just add it and keep ticking along. The other things, I guess, from a plant health perspective is in the last 4 years we've had no red legs in our lucerne. So even in establishing new lucerne, and I really think that that's around the soil microbiology and the soil health. So there, that's meant, savings on insecticide. We don't need to do that anymore. And then another example, and it was raised yesterday around the rust. Neil may correct me, I think it was 3 years ago, we had a good season, and so we were actually running some triticale through to grain. We felt we had enough banked into hay and silage that we could take a paddock through that we could use for our own grain. It was down the river, and it was, this high. We're not grain growers. And we were checking it and we said, oh no, that looks like rust. We'll ring the agronomist. So we rang him, he came out and we said, we think we've got rust. And not dissimilar to Cam, it was the next day or the day after that he came out, and he said to us, yeah, you did. It's died. He said it stopped. He said it's come in and that's it. And so that to us was really powerful, and I think it was quite powerful to him because they're conventional agronomists. We actually now utilise agronomists from the same. We just utilise our agronomist from Landmark, and he's been a graduate now for nearly 2 years. And when he first came to us, he really used to scratch his head. He couldn't understand my resistance to using chemicals and to spraying, and I certainly will go around with a knockdown when I need to. But that diversity in pasture, and we are grazing. I have no issues with, annual ryegrass, anything. If it's a grass, there's no reason to go and spray it out for me. And so he's now come around to our way of thinking and our understanding, and that diversity really plays a major role in our ability to produce a quality feed. But certainly we have a really high focus on that legume base. As I said, we've moved to a lucerne base across the farm. We also use a medic as a base, and the return of clover across our whole farm has been just amazing, and we've sown some clover, but there's been clover come up in paddocks that we haven't seen clover in for years. And again, that's adding to that diversity, and protein is one of the most expensive things that we can import onto a dairy, in usually the form of a meal or lupins. And so basically I still have those things in my grain ration, but we are using I think it's 1 kilo per head per day. And I have fed up to 4.5, 5 kilos of protein sources to my cows. So moving on to the field trials, I've tried to keep this really simple, and I've just pulled out something that was really important to us. The trials were a randomised 3-by replicate design. They commenced in the November 2008. I do have that science background, and very early on I still needed that reassurance of science. As much as I jumped into this head first, I needed that reassurance. Our local dairy group also was looking for something to be looking at and investigating, and effluent management and waste management is a really big issue around dairies across Australia. So the 4 rates of compost were nil, half, 2.5 and 5 tonnes to the hectare. The summer that year there were 2 samples taken from both pasture and the soil, and then again in August 2010. The key result that was really important to me, and if you go back to I was discussing the irrigation and where we wanted to go with that, was looking at the gravimetric soil water content and then the soil resistance. And obviously there's actually a correlation between the two, because as your water holding capacity of your soil increases, then your penetrometer results will reduce. And the gravimetric is actually just a simple water content by weight, and they notate that as theta G. So the key findings were that essentially as the rates of compost increased, so did the water holding capacity essentially. And that's from that gravimetric. The theta G was the gravimetric, that water content by weight. And then, as I said, there's a strong correlation between the two, and that physical resistance from the penetrometer reduced also. And as you can see, they're significant results, given that the least significant difference was 1.4 on the left, and on the right it was 235. So there wasn't a significant difference between the 2.5 and the 5 tonne rates, but there was from them to the control. And so that for me really concreted that what we were doing was the right thing, and that we were headed down that path, that we were looking to be sustainable and looking after our resource of water into the future. So I guess in conclusion, those 5 goals have enabled us to make really positive changes. The first one was recycle our on-farm waste, and that was the key to making the humified compost. We are recycling the products that we're utilising, the products that are coming off our farm, and otherwise really were just eyesores. We have been able to reduce our off-farm inputs, so that's in fertiliser and feed savings. So we're not buying in as much grain, we're not buying in as much hay. We're utilising our own feed that we're producing on farm, and obviously, as I indicated, we're not importing as much fertiliser either. When it comes to fertiliser, something that I didn't mention was that if you were just looking at our P levels in our soil, our P levels have always been quite high, so we've usually sat between 70 and 150, and I have cropping friends that, we're quite envious of that, with totals of 410 to 600. Most recently, we're still sitting at those Ps of 70 to 150, but with that reduced utilisation or that reduced use of fertiliser in our property, I really believe that we're starting to tap into that total and tap into what has been locked up. And again, so that gives me confidence in the system that we're applying. The reduce of irrigation, it's evidenced also, not only by the results from those trials, but also, as I said, I was running a few wide strips through paddocks, and we could visually see that paddocks would wilt where there had been nil compost application. It was visual that those areas needed watering maybe 48 hours before the rest of the paddock was ready for the irrigator to be turned on. And that for us was really powerful. And as I said, we were looking to maintain our pasture production. I don't think we've maintained it. I actually think we've increased it. We've increased the quality and the quantity, and that has far outstripped my expectations of what we were able to do. And then finally, it was around managing those pathogens. And I'm really pleased to say that 5 years down the track, we've got no salmonella. We're negative for strep ag, and we're negative for Staph aureus. And that just, it's a weight off your shoulders when you know that your cows and your operation is leaving you, with a healthy legacy, essentially. And then I guess that is what enables us to have a legacy and a business and land that will be profitable and sustainable. They're my 3 little babies. So for the generations that will follow us. And whether they're farmers or not really doesn't matter. They love the land, and it's interesting to talk about children growing vegetables. My kids are growing up with this, and so they understand the importance of, not using chemicals unless necessary. They understand the compost. My baby was 3 when I started, and she used to sit in the tractor with me. And they're really keen to do things like grow vegetables and understand where food comes from. I guess what Rhonda mentioned was around the leadership. So this year, Gardner Foundation ran a pilot program looking for leaders in dairy. I currently sit on the Dairy New South Wales board, and I was encouraged to apply. It was far out of my comfort zone, but I was accepted, and there were 10 of us put through a pilot leadership program looking for new national and international dairy leaders, and it is around farming for the future. It's around strategic planning and policy, and and I hope somewhere along the line that my children will really get to benefit from a dairy industry that's still around and thriving in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, for a wonderful presentation.